How much did it actually cost me to rebuild this over 30-year-old motorcycle over the winter? In this video, we're gonna find out. But before we get into the numbers, a quick story about how I ended up with this bike. So I had been looking for an XRV 750 for a while now, just casually browsing, waiting for something reasonably priced to pop up. Then one day, this listing came up, and it looked promising. Not perfect, but good enough to be worth checking out. When the listing came up, it was a Saturday, and the dealership was actually closed. But I called anyway, and managed to reserve it until Monday. So Monday morning, I had a day off work, jumped into the car and drove about 2 hours to go see it. When I got there, yeah, it wasn't perfect. The front suspension was leaking, the engine had oil leaks, both of the little front fairings, the so-called hockey sticks pieces, were literally taped on. The front tire had uneven wear, there were scratches and small defects all over the bike. On top of all that, it had about 92,000 kilometers on the clock with no service history whatsoever. But still, there was just something about it. I took it for a quick test drive, and it just had that proper old school feel, all the 19s vibes. The switches, the big round headlights, the retro colors, it was just all there. After a quick test drive, I did the paperwork, loaded it up on the trailer and headed back home. I rode it for a couple of months that summer, just enjoying it as it was. But I already knew that during those rides that if I wanted to keep it long term, I needed to do a proper going through. So when the winter came, I parked it and started the rebuild. Just a quick note on how this is structured. I've split everything into 4 main categories: the engine, frame and suspension, wheels, tires and brakes, and then some miscellaneous stuff that didn't really fit into the other categories. This is parts only, no labor. If I had paid someone to do all this, it would have been a completely different story. So, starting with the engine. The parts list for this category was easily the longest. Even though I didn't go for a full internal rebuild, I still ended up replacing a lot of parts. Basically, anything that wears out, leaks or becomes questionable over time. Gaskets for pretty much every corner, a ton of O-rings, oil seals, bearings, water pump related parts, clutch components including plates and spring, and a bunch of small OEM hardware that were either broken, worn out or just generally in a bad shape. And this is where the costs really start to build up. Individually, a lot of these parts are cheap, 5, 10, 15 euros. But when you start stacking dozens of them together, it becomes a good amount of money. There were also some slightly bigger items, clutch kit, bearings, some OEM parts that aren't exactly cheap, and then a little extra like engine paint, spark plug caps, replacement bolts. The clutch itself was actually fine, but since I didn't have any service history for the bike, I decided to replace it anyway. In hindsight, I probably could have reused the old one, but at least now I know it's fresh. All of that combined, the engine category ended up at 840 euros and 97 cents. And honestly, I think this is one of those areas where it makes sense. Because once the engine is apart, you don't really want to skip replacing cheap seals and then deal with leaks later. Next up, frame and suspension. This is where the costs become a bit more visible, because there are a few bigger ticket items. The biggest one by far was the frame painting, about 800 euros. All of the painted parts were actually sandblasted and powder coated So that wasn't just a quick respray. It was the price for all the parts sandblasted and powder coated in white, grey and black. Here are the paint codes that I used for each color. I used these raw colors since they are very close to the original color. To be honest, I wasn't able to spot a difference between the original white and the raw that I used, and they are also readily available in most places that do powder coating. On top of that, steering head bearings, fork bushings and seals, chain slider swing arm protection, handlebar mounts, various bolts and hardware. I actually had to replace the handlebar mounts since I broke one of the bolts while I tried to tighten them. That was an unnecessary and unfortunate extra cost. Probably the most expensive mechanical part in this section: suspension linkage bearings and bushings. Some of these bearings are discontinued. Same goes with the colors. But fortunately, there's still a website that you can order these parts from, and they are actually quite reasonably priced. The linkage was completely seized, so that needed a full refresh. There wasn't really any option to reuse anything there, apart from maybe one or two colors. When you add everything together, frame and suspension comes out to 1483 euros and 38 cents, which makes it the single most expensive category so far. And honestly, that surprised me a bit, but when you include paint and all the suspension work, it makes sense. Moving on to the wheels, tires and brakes. This is one of those categories where you don't really have a choice. If you want the bike to be safe and ride properly, you just have to spend the money. In my case, the tires definitely needed replacing. They were old and the front had uneven wear, so those had to go. Along with that, new inner tubes, wheel bearings, shock service, brake related parts, and installation work for the tires. The tires alone were over 256 euros, and then everything else stacks on top of that pretty quickly. Total here is 698 euros and 49 cents. And then finally, the category that always gets out of control: miscellaneous. This is basically everything that doesn't neatly fit in anywhere else. Things like carburetor parts, diaphragms, slides, fuel pump parts, thermostat, throttle components, exhaust, filters, and just general hardware. The original muffler was also in a pretty bad shape, so that had to be replaced. This is also where you get a lot of those "oh, I'll just order this one extra thing" moments, and those add up fast. Total amount for miscellaneous parts: 427 euros and 45 cents. Alright, so when you combine everything, the engine, frame and suspension, wheels, tires and brakes, miscellaneous stuff, that brings the total cost for the rebuild to 2,879 euros and 70 cents. And again, that's parts only. No labor, no tools. If we include the price of the bike itself, that brings the total to 5,309 euros and 70 cents. Realistically, I've probably missed a part here and there in my tracking, small things, random hardware, stuff like that. So if we add another 100 euros on top, we're probably pretty close to the real total. So let's call it roughly 5,400 euros all in. Yeah, it's a decent amount of money. I probably could have bought something like a BMW GS series, something along those lines, to get a newer bike just to go adventure with. But at the same time, when doing the rebuild by yourself, you end up with a bike that you have gone through yourself. You understand inside and out, and you know exactly what condition everything is in. And that's quite crucial when you're on your adventure. And for me, that's kind of the whole point of a project like this. Some parts were replaced because of my mistakes or because I just wanted to play it safe. So technically you could squeeze out a few euros from this, but this is roughly where the price point would go. So, what do you think about that number? Honestly, it's about what I expected, maybe a slightly more. But at the same time, when you look at what's been done, the bike is refreshed, most wear items are replaced, suspension is sorted, engine is sealed and cleaned up, it starts to make sense. And this is kind of reality with older bikes. You can buy them relatively cheap, but bringing them back properly always costs more than you think. Still, I think it's worth it. If you've been following the rebuild series, you've already seen most of this work happen step by step. This video just puts a number on it. And if you're planning on your own project, hopefully this gives you a more realistic idea of what you're getting into. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.